Hey guys, it's Megan. So today I want to talk about the connection between copyright, labor exploitation, and AI. And so before I dive into the main argument, I just want to start by acknowledging that there are some legitimate labor exploitation things happening with AI that aren't really getting talked about enough. One of the biggest ones is that when you have particularly image-based data sets, someone has to go through and say, look at all the pictures of dogs and say, yes, this is a dog. No, this is a dog. No, it's not. The only way to train a computer to do that is to have humans do it first. And so a lot of AI, a lot of this like image recognition in particular, and then the image recognition that turns into image creation, the foundation of that is real underpaid humans sitting at computers all day long going, dog, not dog, dog, not dog. And so that is important to acknowledge, but that's not actually what I want to talk about in this video. So what I really want to talk about is this idea that copyright is about, and basically defensive copyright is about protecting labor exploitation. And this is not a reading of copyright that I think gets talked about enough. So when we talk about copyright, what we're talking about is what's known as an intellectual property law. So intellectual property laws are things like copyright, trademark. It's basically saying that this thing that's being protected is the result of someone's intellect. It's the result of someone's thought process, their brain, their ideas, their imagination. And so it's worthy of being protected. And while I do think that is valuable, when we look at copyright as only intellectual property, it obscures the very real labor that goes into making creative works, right? Yes, when I write a book, it is absolutely a product of my imagination, but it is also a product of my labor. It is me sitting down and writing the words, putting the words on paper. When I make a piece of jewelry or when I create a painting, the same thing, right? There is very real labor that goes into making creative works. And so I believe that a big part of copyright enforcement is not just protecting our ideas, it's protecting our labor. And I think a really good example of this is a Supreme Court case that came out last year, which was the Andy Warhol Foundation versus Lynn Goldsmith. So this made a big deal in the art circles. I wrote about it on my blog, Designing an MBA. But the kind of basic gist of the case is that back in the 80s, the photographer Lynn Goldsmith took a photograph of the artist Prince. And then Andy Warhol licensed that photograph for a one-time use, and this one-time use part becomes very important. Andy Warhol licensed this photograph for a one-time use to create a silkscreen, to create a piece of art from it for a publication. Now, fast forward to 2016, Prince dies. Condé Nast, who used the original image, went back to, now Andy Warhol's also did, went back to the Andy Warhol Foundation, who owns the rights to his work, and said, hey, we would like to use this image again. And so they did. And then what happened was Lynn Goldsmith went, hey, wait a second, you only paid me for a one-time use of this thing. And so I'm going to sue you. And then the Andy Warhol Foundation sued back for defamation. So the Andy Warhol Foundation sued Lynn Goldsmith for defamation. And that is the case that made its way to the Supreme Court. And basically the Supreme Court ruled that the Andy Warhol Foundation did not have the right to use the artwork based on Lynn Goldsmith's image again, without further compensation to her. And so there was a lot that happened in the art world where people were like, oh, this is the end of art, and Andy Warhol is a genius, and blah, blah, blah. And if you read the dissent of the Supreme Court ruling, that was kind of the focus of the dissent. Like, Andy Warhol is a genius, and so, you know, we have to protect art, and this is a ruling against art. But what that missed was that Lynn Goldsmith is also an artist, and it was her creative labor that enabled Andy Warhol to create the work. Now, there's a whole piece in copyright law about transformation and how much you have to transform a piece in order for it to make sense. But at the end of the day, without the Lynn Goldsmith portrait, the Andy Warhol work could not exist. And so what the ruling basically said was that Lynn Goldsmith, her labor was part of this process, and she deserved to be compensated for that labor. And I think that is fucking fantastic. And so this is where I get really hung up on AI, because AI is built upon all of our creative labor. And whether or not it technically falls under copyright, because this is one of the challenges with AI, is people are starting to sue over these AI data sets' use of their creative work. And some of the initial rulings are basically finding that if you haven't applied for a copyright, if you haven't properly protected your work, then there's nothing you can do about it, which in and of itself is bullshit, because copyright, while great in a lot of ways, the official registration of it can get very expensive when you're talking about, say, putting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs or images online, right? So there's already an issue there where we're kind of set up to fail if we aren't protecting every single work in the proper channels. But what I think is really key, and what discussions of copyright and AI are missing, is that when you use AI to generate content, right? I understand that you can use AI in a lot of different ways, but when you use AI to generate content, the AI generation is built off of someone else's creative labor, and it is built off of their unpaid creative labor because they haven't given permission for AI to use it in most cases, and they haven't been compensated for AI to use it. And so what we end up with is this scenario where work is being created, and not only are the people who created the foundation for that work not being credited, but other people are profiting off their labor. And that is labor exploitation. And so for me, I think that there's this really strong connection between copyright and labor exploitation, where copyright is designed to stop some degree of labor exploitation for creatives, right? Most labor exploitation laws are based on when you have the relationship of an employee and a boss, right? So labor exploitation is set up so that, my boss can't underpay me. That's minimum wage, right? That I get paid extra for overtime. That there are all of these things that are set up for labor exploitation in this boss-worker relationship. But the problem for most of us creatives is that we're not traditional workers. We're not employed by someone. We don't have a boss. But that doesn't mean that our labor can't be exploited. And so copyright is a tool to keep our labor from being exploited, whether that's by another artist or by a major corporation or by a tech company who's using AI to profit off of our unpaid and uncredited labor. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge this relationship here, because copyright is more than just intellectual property. Yes, there is absolutely stuff that comes out of our brains as creatives that deserves to be protected. But the way that stuff gets from our brains to the world is through our creative labor. And so it's really important that we understand this connection between copyright, labor exploitation, and then as we're moving into AI, because it's the only way we're going to basically stand up and say, hey, we need our fair share when it comes to AI. Here's the thing about AI. At this point, the genie is out of the bottle. I've heard people talk about this before. The genie is out of the bottle. There is basically not much we can do, right? There are some things you can do, to stop AI at this point from scrubbing your work, right? To stop these big data sets from looking at your work. There are, glazes you can put on images. You can, certain things like Substack let you opt out of AI. There's code you can put on your own website. Great. All of that is great. It's a little too late, because chances are if you already put it on the internet, it's already been scraped. And unfortunately, these data sets are so massive and so obscure that we can't know if we've been scraped. But I think it's pretty safe to assume that if you're creative and you put work online, your shit's been scraped. And so that means that regardless of the way that copyright law is written now, our labor is being exploited. These companies are profiting off of our creative labor. And so, what can we do about this? I think this is where we really have to start to push for better legislation for better understanding of copyright and labor exploitation and how these things relate to each other. And I think it's also important to start to ask for our piece of the pie, right? At this point, companies that are profiting off of our creative labor need to be paying us for our creative labor, right? And this is about more than just AI, right? I think it's bullshit that Instagram has stopped paying creators, that TikTok has stopped paying creators. Like, you are making billions of dollars off of our creative labor, and we deserve a piece of that pie, right? So, those are kind of like the initial thoughts about this, but I think it's just really important to understand that the conversation about copyright infringement needs to be more than just about intellectual property. It needs to be a conversation about how when people are infringing on our copyrights, whether those copyrights are legally formed or whether they are just implicit, when people are infringing on their copyrights, that is literal theft of our creative labor, that is labor exploitation. And I think the sooner that we as creatives start to frame it in that way, we can start to have these broader conversations about how tech exploits labor, about how capitalism exploits labor, and we can start to look at ourselves in solidarity to, workers. We can start to look at ourselves in solidarity to the Screen Actors strike, to the Writers Guild strike. We can start to look at ourselves in solidarity with other workers, because at the end of the day, yes, what we do comes from our brains and it comes from our minds and it comes from our art, but it doesn't just show up in the other fully formed. It is the result of creative labor. And so when someone steals our work, whether that's a person, a corporation, or an AI system, when someone steals our work, that is not just theft of our work, that is labor exploitation. And so I just wanted to share that connection. Hopefully that sheds some light on kind of thinking about it in this new way. It's something I think about a lot. And if you have any other thoughts or comments, please let me know. And if you want to see more of these videos, please like and subscribe. Thanks, guys.